At 45 years old, Della Hartley was walked out of a motel office she had run for 19 years with a cardboard box in her arms, $163 left in her checking account, and a termination letter that called 19 winters of quiet decency a case of revenue fraud. The regional manager who signed it did not look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on his clipboard, the way men do when they have decided you are a number that no longer balances, and he told her to leave her keys on the counter. He was certain she would disappear the way women like her always disappeared, into some smaller life, some quieter shame, some apartment with a microwave and a television and nothing left to fight for. What he never imagined, what nobody in that high cold corner of Montana ever imagined, was that the condemned motor court her late father had left her on Halloran Pass, the one the county had appraised at exactly $0, the one her own brother told her to sign away to the first man who offered cash, of an old front desk that would bring a developer board to until it stop developer had been doing in the dark to a dead stop and remind an entire town. What didn't they dark? For 30 years. Stay with me until the very end. Because what Della found inside that desk did not just save a worthless building. It revealed a debt the size of a whole community. And it proved that the gentlest people are the ones the world should be most afraid of underestimating. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from tonight. And if a story like this means something to you, make sure you're subscribed, because there is a moment near the end of this one that I promise you will not see coming. Della Hartley had spent her whole life being the kind of woman other people called reliable, which is a word that sounds like a compliment and functions like a leash. Not bright in the way that draws attention, not ambitious in the way the world rewards, just reliable, steady as the snow line, the woman who showed up early and stayed late and made sure the people around her were taken care of, even on the nights when no one thought to ask whether she was. She had grown up in Quill, Montana, a town of 900 people folded into the bottom of a valley where Halloran Pass came down out of the mountains and met the old state highway. Her mother had cleaned rooms at the lodge in town. Her father had run a motor court up on the pass, 11 miles of switchbacks, above the valley floor, where the trucks came over the summit and the weather turned without warning and a lit window could be the difference between a bad night and a final one. She had learned early what work looked like. She had learned even earlier what it cost to be the person everyone leaned on. Her father was a man named Walter Hartley, though everyone on the pass had called him Walt, and Della had spent most of her adult life not speaking to him. It was not a dramatic estrangement. There had been no single fight, no slammed door, no unforgivable word. It was the slow, quiet kind of distance that builds between two people who love each other and cannot find the language for it. The kind that hardens one missed Christmas at a time until 12 years have gone by, and neither of you remember exactly how the silence started or how it got so deep. She had left Quill at 23. She had married a man named Roy Sutton who turned out to be charming in the way that cost you everything. And when that marriage finally collapsed at 31, she had not gone home. Pride is a strange shelter. It keeps the rain off and it freezes you solid. She had built her life instead around a job. The thing she could never explain to anyone, the thing she had stopped trying to explain even to herself, was that she had not left her father because she stopped loving him. She had left because loving him had begun to feel like standing in a cold house with the windows open. Walt Hartley had been a man who showed everything he felt by doing, and almost nothing by saying. When Della was 9 and broke her wrist falling off the propane tank she'd been told 100 times not to climb, he had driven her 40 minutes to the hospital in Helena at midnight with one hand on the wheel and the other flat on her back. And he had not said a word the whole way, not one. And she had understood even then that the silence was the love, and the love was the silence, and that she would spend her life trying to hear it. He gave away rooms to strangers, and could not bring himself to call his own daughter on her birthday. He patched a stranger's roof in the rain and let 12 years of Christmases go by without picking up the phone. It was not that he had no heart. It was that his heart only knew how to speak one language, the language of the lamp and the patched roof and the warm stew, and Della had needed, just once, to hear it out loud, and he had never managed it, and she had finally stopped waiting. That was the whole estrangement. There was no villain in it. That was what made it unforgivable, and that was what made it, in the end, the easiest thing in the world to forgive. The Cardinal Inn was a budget motel franchise off Exit 9 down in the valley, 60 rooms and a flickering sign, and a parking lot full of people passing through on their way to somewhere they could afford to be. Della had started there at 26 as a night clerk and worked her way up to manager, and for 19 years, she had been the soul of that ugly little building. She knew the regulars. She knew the trucker who drove the Billings route and tipped in stories. She knew the families who came through every summer on their way to the lake, the kids a little taller each year. She kept a box of granola bars under the desk for the ones who came in hungry, and a basket of mismatched gloves by the door in winter, and a quiet understanding with the night house keeper that nobody who showed up shaking and afraid at 2 in the morning would ever be turned away into the cold without at least the offer of a chair and a phone. She did all of it without making a fuss. That was the part that mattered to her. That was the part the corporation could not see. The trouble came in February, on a night when the pass closed, and the valley filled with the kind of blizzard that turns a highway into a rumor. A woman came into the Cardinal Inn a little after midnight with 2 children, and a split lip and no purse, no card, no cash, nothing but a pickup truck idling in the lot with a man's name still on the registration and a look on her face that Della had seen before and would have recognized in her sleep. Della did not ask many questions. She put the woman and her kids in room 114, the quiet one at the end away from the highway, and she ran the room as a comp, and she logged it as a maintenance hold so the night audit would not flag it, and she sat with that woman in the lobby for an hour while the children slept, and she made 2 phone calls, and she did not write down the woman's real name anywhere a man with a registration could find it. The woman left before dawn, when the plows had finally opened the on-ramp, and she did not say where she was going. And Della did not ask, because asking was a thing that could be repeated to the wrong person later. She left a note on the nightstand of room 114, written on the back of a Cardinal Inn notepad. 3 words and no name, and Della kept it in the drawer of the front desks for the rest of that winter, and read it more than once on the nights when the job felt like nothing but a flickering sign over an empty lot. Thank you, we made it. That was all. It was enough. She did the same thing 3 more times before spring. A family from Idaho, whose old sedan threw a rod on the highway shoulder with a 6-week-old baby in a car seat in the back, the mother walking the parking lot at 1 in the morning, bouncing the infant against the cold, the father on his knees in the slush with a flashlight in his teeth, and Dellaby had put them in room 109 and brought them the space heater from the back office, and warmed bottles in the lobby microwave until the parts store opened. An old man, clearly a veteran, clearly carrying something heavier than the duffel bag he set down by the door, who had been sleeping in the bus shelter on exit 9 for 3 nights, and would not have survived the cold front the radio kept warning about, a wind chill of 30 below coming down off the mountains. He had not wanted to come in. That was the thing Della remembered. He had stood in the doorway with the snow blowing in around him and tried to refuse, because some people have had charity weaponized against them so many times that kindness reads as a trap. And she had told him it was not a favor, it was a room nobody was using, and he could shovel the walk in the morning if it made him feel square. He had taken the room, he had shoveled the walk, he had been gone by the time she came back on shift. And a teenager, 18, if he was a day, but with the lost dog eyes of someone a great deal younger, who had come in out of the dark with a backpack and a bus ticket he had missed, and the particular brittle pride of a kid who has just learned that the people who were supposed to keep him safe will not. He needed 1 night indoors to figure out the rest of his life, and Della had given it to him, room 112, and she had left a granola bar and a $5 bill on the dresser and not made a thing of it, and in the morning the room was empty and the $5 was gone, but the bed was made carefully. Hospital corners, the way a kid makes a bed when he wants you to know he was raised better than his circumstances. 4 comped rooms across 1 brutal winter. Della never once thought of it as a decision. She thought of it the way you think of breathing, which is to say she did not think of it at all until someone tried to take it away from her. She thought of it as the only thing a person could possibly do. The corporate audit thought of it as something else. In March, a regional efficiency review flagged a pattern of unaccounted room nights at the Quill location. 4 rooms logged as maintenance holds, no revenue, no incident reports, no paper trail that a spreadsheet could love. They sent a regional manager named Brent Cooley, a man of maybe 35 in a fleece vest with a company logo on it, and he sat across the desk from Della in the office she had run for 19 years, and he used the words liability and exposure and fiduciary responsibility. and he never once used the word person. Della tried to explain. She told him about the woman with the split lip. She told him there were children. She told him it had been 20 below outside and the pass was closed, and there was nowhere else for these people to go. Brent coolly nodded, the way people nod when they are waiting for you to finish, so they can say the thing they already decided to say. He told her that the company's policy on charitable accommodation was very clear, that there were liability concerns, that she had falsified records to conceal the comps, and that this constituted, in the language of the letter he then slid across the desk, revenue fraud. He told her to leave her keys on the counter. She was 45 years old. She had given that building 19 years and the best parts of herself. And she walked out into the gray March light with a cardboard box and a coat and the dawning understanding that everything she had believed about being good, about being steady, about being the one who could always be counted on, had just been weighed by people who counted differently and found wanting. She drove to her apartment. She sat at her kitchen table. She did the arithmetic that grief always eventually forces you to do, and the arithmetic said $163 in checking, rent due in 11 days, and a job market in Quill, Montana that had room for exactly none of what she was. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying was a thing you did later, alone when it could not be used against you. Instead, she sat very still in the cold kitchen and let the silence settle over her like the first snow over a closed road. The phone call came 9 days later. It was a lawyer in Helena, brisk and not unkind, and he told her that her father, Walter Hartley, had died in his sleep on the 14th of March, and that she was the executor and sole beneficiary of his estate. Della sat with the phone against her ear, and the strange weightless feeling of a door closing on a room she had been meaning to enter for 12 years and now never would. She had not spoken to her father in over a decade. He had died 11 miles up the mountain from the town where she was born, and she had not been there, and there was no fixing that now. The lawyer cleared his throat and told her there was the matter of the property. The Switchback Motor Court on Halloran Pass. He said it the way a man says a thing he is sorry to have to mention. He told her the county had it appraised at zero. Back taxes, deferred for years, out of what the assessor's office had apparently treated as a kind of municipal embarrassment. Structures in poor condition. A stretch of old highway that the interstate had bypassed in 1991, which meant the traffic that had once made the place a living had not come up that road in over 30 years. He told her, gently, that her father had left her a building that was worth less than nothing, that in fact came with a liability in the form of those unpaid taxes, and that the simplest thing, the thing most people in her position chose, would be to disclaim the inheritance and let the county take it. Della thanked him. She told him she would need to see it first. She drove up Halloran Pass on a Tuesday morning in early April, when the snow had pulled back to the tree line but the air at altitude still had teeth. The road climbed in long switchbacks through stands of lodgepole pine, and the smell came in through the cracked window the way it had when she was a girl, pine resin and cold stone and the faint mineral breath of snowmelt, a smell that lived in some old room of her memory she had kept the door shut on for 30 years. She had not been up this road since she was 23. She had told herself it was because she was busy. She had told herself a great many things. The Switchback Motor Court sat in a wide gravel pull-off at the top of the third long curve, where the mountain opened briefly into a shelf of flat ground and you could see all the way down into the valley and the toy-sized town at the bottom of it. It was a single low building in an L shape, 8 units and an office, the kind of motor court they had stopped building when America stopped driving slowly. The roof sagged at the far end. The paint, which Della remembered as a warm cream, had weathered to the gray of old bone. The big sign by the road still stood, a tall stool post with a hand-painted board, and most of the letters had faded past reading, but she could still make out the shape of the word that had been her father's whole life. Vacancy, and below it, smaller in her father's careful block letters, faded almost to nothing but not quite gone, always. She stood in the gravel lot in the cold, bright air and looked at it for a long time. Brent Cooley had slid a letter across a desk and told her what 19 years were worth. Her brother had called the night before, from his comfortable life in Denver, and told her to sign the thing away to the county and be done with it, that it was a money pit, that Dad had been a stubborn old fool who could never let a dead business die. And here, at the top of a road nobody drove anymore, was a building the entire world had appraised at zero. She had a feeling, standing there, that the world had made a habit lately of appraising things it did not understand. Preparing and narrating these stories takes us a great deal of time. So if you're finding something here worth your while, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel alive. Now, back up the mountain with Della. The office door was not locked. That was the first thing that stopped her. In 19 years of running a motel, she had developed an almost religious feeling about locked doors. And her father's office at the top of an abandoned pass, 11 miles from town, with no one to watch it, stood open to anyone who turned the handle. She pushed it in, and the hinges complained, and the smell came out to meet her. Cold wood smoke from a stove gone out weeks ago. Dust and old paper. The particular still air of a room where a man had lived alone and recently stopped. She stepped inside. The office was small and worn and almost unbearably familiar. A front desk of dark varnished pine ran along one wall, its surface scarred with decades of use. Behind it hung a pegboard of room keys, 8 of them, each on a diamond-shaped fob her father had cut and sanded himself. There was a wood stove in the corner, cold, with a stack of split lodgepole beside it. There was an armchair with the stuffing showing at one elbow, and a reading lamp beside it, and a low shelf of paperback westerns gone soft with handling. And on the desk, in a heavy brass holder green with age, there was an oil lamp. Not electric. An actual oil lamp, the kind with a wick and a glass chimney. The chimney smoked dark at the top from years of burning. Beside it lay a box of wooden matches and a small tin of lamp oil, and a square of cardboard on which her father had written, in the same block letters as the sign outside, 4 words she would not understand for several more days. Keep the light on. Della stood in her father's office and felt the 12 years between them open up under her feet like a crevasse. She did not cry then either. She had work to do, and work was the only language her body had ever fully trusted. She spent that first day doing what she knew how to do, which was to take inventory of a building. She walked the 8 units one by one with a flashlight and a notebook. Most of them were in the rough shape the lawyer had promised. Soft floors, water stains, a smell of mildew in the 2 on the low end. But they were not the ruins she had braced for. The roofs had been patched, recently by hand, with a competence that surprised her. The beds were made. Every room had clean linens folded at the foot of the mattress, and a spare blanket in the closet, and, she noticed as she went, a small card on each nightstand in her father's handwriting that said the same thing. No charge if you need it. Pay it forward when you can. She found herself standing in the doorway of Unit 4 for a long while, holding that card, not entirely sure what she was looking at. The units told a story she did not yet know how to read. They were poor, yes, water-stained and tired, the carpet worn to the backing in the doorways where 30 years of boots had come in out of the snow. But they were not the rooms of a man who had given up. Someone had been keeping them ready. Someone had been laundering linens for guests who, by every economic measure Della understood, did not exist, on a road no one drove, in a building no one would have blamed an old man for letting rot around him. The soap in the bathrooms was unwrapped and waiting. The water glasses were clean and turned upside down on folded paper. In the closet of Unit 6 she found a child's nightlight, a little plastic moon, plugged into the wall and switched off. As though her father had wanted a frightened kid in the dark to have at least that, the soft suggestion that the night was not total. She stood in Unit 6, with the plastic moon in her hand, and felt the shape of a question, forming that she did not have words for. Who were all these rooms for? Who had he been keeping the light on for, all this time, at the top of a dead road? It was the dog that found her, not the other way around. She had come back out to the lot in the failing light to get a tarp from her car, and when she straightened up, there was a dog standing at the edge of the gravel where it met the trees, watching her. He was old, gray around the muzzle, some big shepherd mix, gone lean with years, and he was missing his left front leg clean at the shoulder. He stood balanced on the other 3, with the patient steadiness of an animal who had made his peace with the arrangement a long time ago. And he did not bark, and he did not come closer, and he did not run. He just watched her with a kind of grave attention, as though he were the one deciding whether she could be trusted on this mountain. And not the other way around. Della crouched down slow and held out a hand. The dog considered it. Then he came across the gravel on his 3 legs, unhurried, and pressed the side of his big gray head against her palm and let out a breath that seemed to have been held for a very long time. There was a collar under the fur, worn leather, and a brass tag her father had clearly made himself, and on it was stamped a single word. Tuck. She did not know yet that Tuck was the first witness. She did not know yet that there would be others, dozens of others, that the dog leaning his weight against her hand in the cold April dusk was the first living proof of what her father had quietly been for 30 years, the first entry in a ledger she had not yet found. She only knew that the animal was hungry and three-legged and waiting. That he had clearly been waiting at this spot for weeks, for a man who was never coming back, and that she could not possibly leave him there. She fed him the last of the granola bars from her glove box, the ones she had carried out of the Cardinal Inn in her cardboard box, and she let him follow her into the office, and when she lit the wood stove against the mountain cold, he lay down in front of it with a groan, and put his gray head on his one front paw and watched her with those grave brown eyes. Della sat in her father's chair with the broken elbow and looked at the oil lamp and the card that said, "Keep the light on," and the three-legged dog her father had clearly loved. And for the first time in 9 days, in 19 years and longer than she could honestly say, she felt the cold thing in her chest move slightly. The way a closed door moves when someone on the other side leans against it. She stayed the night. She had not planned to. She lit the oil lamp because the card told her to and because the electricity in the units was off, and she watched the small flame steady itself in the glass chimney and throw its warm light across the worn office. And she understood dimly that her father had kept this lamp burning every single night of his life up here, a light at the top of a road nobody drove, for travelers who almost never came. It made no sense. It made no business sense, no economic sense, no sense of any kind that Brent Cooley and his clipboard could have measured. And yet there it was, smoke darkened from 30 years of burning. She fell asleep in the armchair with the dog at her feet and woke to mountain light coming gray and gold through the dusty window, and a decision had made itself in her somewhere during the night, the way decisions sometimes do. She was not going to disclaim the inheritance. Not yet, not until she understood what she had inherited. The first weeks were a hard, plain education in everything she did not know. The well pump had to be primed by hand, and she got it wrong twice and stood there soaked and swearing at a pipe before she got it right. She split her own wood for the stove, and she was bad at it. At first, the maul bouncing off the rounds, until an old man named Earl, who ran the store down in Quill, drove up unasked one afternoon with a splitting wedge and showed her how to read the grain, how to look for the check the wood wanted to break along, and then sat on the tailgate and watched her do 12 rounds, which she came to understand was a kind to take the maul. Which she came to understand was a kind of Earl had known her father. Everyone in Quill had known her father, it turned out. In the glancing way, you know a man you assume you have all the time in the world to know better. They remembered Walt at the feed store and the gas station and the one diner, remembered him as quiet, as fair, as a man who paid cash and kept to himself, and not one of them, not a single one, had any idea what he had been doing up on that pass. Della would learn that too in time, that the people closest to a quiet life are sometimes the last to see its shape. She found his habits in the office like fossils. A spiral notebook by the window where, every single morning for 30 years, he had written down in a kind of private shorthand, the temperature and the wind and whether the pass was open, page after page after page, a man keeping faith with the mountain. A coffee can of bent nails he had clearly straightened by hand on winter nights, because new nails cost money he would rather keep for guests. A cigar box of his reading glasses, 4 pairs, all repaired with tape and fishing line. She held those taped glasses in her hand for a long time. Here was a man who would give a stranger a free room for a week and would not spend $6 on glasses for himself. She had spent 12 years thinking she did not understand her father. She was beginning to suspect she had understood him perfectly and had simply never forgiven him for being exactly what he was. It took her 3 more days to find the ledger, and she found it by accident, which seemed to be exactly how her father had arranged for most important things to be found. She had been trying to fix the front desk. The varnished pine top had a warp in it, where the wood had pulled away from the frame along the back edge, and as she worked a flat bar under it, to reseat it, the whole rear panel of the desk, which she had taken for solid, swung loose on a hidden hinge her father had built into it decades ago. Behind the panel was a shallow cavity, dry and clean and clearly made on purpose, and inside the cavity were 2 things. The first was a steel cash box, old and dented, and when she opened it, she found not money but a thick sheaf of letters, dozens of them, in dozens of different hands, on every kind of paper, some of them yellowed soft with age. The second was a book. It was a ledger. A proper one, the white accountant's kind with a marbled cover and a red cloth spine, the sort of book that in any other building on earth would hold columns of dollars in and dollars out. Della lifted it out of the cavity and set it on the desk in the morning light and opened it. And her breath went still in her chest in a way she would not have been able to explain to anyone who had not stood where she was standing. Hold on. Before she turns that first page, I have to ask you for one thing, because what is written in this book is the whole heart of the story, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. If stories about quiet, decent people finally being seen mean something to you, take 1 second right now to subscribe and to tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep finding stories like this one now. Let's open her father's book together. It was not a record of money. That was the first thing Della understood. There were no dollar amounts at all. Instead, in her father's careful block letters, going back, she would later confirm, to the spring of 1991, the year the interstate had been finished and the traffic had stopped coming up Halloran Pass, there were names, dates, and next to each one, a few short lines describing a single human being on the worst or most frightened night of their life, and what Walter Hartley had done about it. April 3, 1991. Young couple, car off the road below the third curve, soaked through, room 2 3 nights, until the part came in from Billings. He would not take money. I told him to keep it for the baby coming. She read it twice, then she turned the page. The names went on. They filled that page and the next, and the one after that, year after year, decade after decade, in the same patient block hand that grew very slightly shakier as the dates climbed toward the present. A trucker who had jackknifed in an ice storm and sat in the office for 2 days until the road cleared, fed from Walt's own stove. A runaway girl of 19, half frozen, whom Walt had not turned out and had not turned in, but had instead driven down the mountain himself to a shelter in town once she was warm enough to choose it. A man just out of prison with nowhere to go, given room 6 and a week of work patching roofs in exchange for the dignity of not being given anything for free. A family fleeing a wildfire 2 counties over with everything they owned in a horse trailer. A veteran, the same as the one Della had sheltered at the Ernleken Trussless Streets, had stayed 3 winters running, off and on, until Walt had helped him get into the VA system in Helena. Beside many of the entries, her father had drawn a small symbol, a tiny lamp, the same shape as the one burning on his desk, and Della came to understand that the lamp meant the same thing every time. It meant the room had been free. It meant the light had been on for them. Some of the entries were a single line. Some ran to a whole paragraph, in nights when whatever had come up the mountain had clearly cost her father something to write down. February 1994. Found a man in his car below the second curve, no heat, near gone. Got him warm. He would not say his name and I did not ask it. Some nights you just keep them alive and let them keep the rest. March 2001. The Peterson family, 4 of them, house burned. Stayed 11 days. Would not take charity, so I invented work until they had their feet again. People will accept a hand-up who will never accept a handout. Remember that. Some of the later entries were addressed, Della slowly realized, to no one and to everyone. Little notes her father had left himself, or left for whoever finally opened the book, a man talking quietly across time to a reader he must have known would someday come. They never come up this road by accident, one of them said. By the time they get to me, they have run out of every other road. So the light has to be on. That is the whole job. The light has to be on. There were more than 400 entries. Della Hartley sat behind her dead father's desk with a 3-legged dog asleep at her feet and a book in her hands that held 30 years of a goodness so quiet that his own daughter had not known it existed. And she finally cried. Not the careful private crying of a woman who has learned to do it where it cannot be used against her. The other kind. The kind that comes up to the floor of you and takes the whole house down with it. She cried for her father, alone on his mountain, keeping a light on for strangers for 30 years. She cried for the 12 years of silence she could never now take back. And she cried, somewhere underneath all of it, for a woman with a split lip, 2 sleeping children, and the company that had called what Walt did his whole life by the name of fraud. When she could see again, she turned to the cash box and the letters. They were thank you notes, every one of them. Some were a single line on a torn scrap, some ran for pages. They came from all over the country, postmarked from 40 states, because the people Walt had sheltered had gone on, gotten back on their feet, found their way to whatever came next, and a startling number of them had taken the time, sometimes years later, to write back up the mountain and tell the quiet man at the top of the pass what that one warm night had meant. "We named her after the room you gave us," said one. "Room 2, we named our girl Marlowe, but we call her 2. "I would not be alive to write this if your light had been off that night," said another, in the shaking hand of someone for whom that was not a figure of speech. "I am a nurse now," said a third. "I take care of people on their worst nights. I learned it from you." Della read everyone. It took her the rest of the day and into the dark, the oil lamp lit beside her, the dogs breathing slow and even on the floor. And when she was done, she understood that she had not inherited a worthless building on a dead road. She had inherited the single most valuable thing her father had ever made, which was a debt the whole region owed him and did not know how to repay, and the only instruction he had left for what to do with it, written on a square of cardboard in his block letters. Keep the light on. She did not yet know how she was going to live. She had $163 in a property the county valued at nothing and no income and no plan. But she lit the lamp again the next night, and the night after that, and on the fourth night, 11 miles up a road that the world had forgotten, headlights came around the third curve and climbed toward the only light burning on the mountain. The man who got out of the truck was named Cyrus Beale. He was somewhere past 60, weathered and slow-moving, and he stood in the lamplight at the edge of the lot and took off his cap when he saw it was a woman in the doorway and not the man he had come looking for. He asked, in a careful voice, if Walt was around, and when Della told him gently that her father had passed in March, the big man's face came apart in a way that told her everything before he said a word. Cyrus Beale stood in the gravel lot and wept for a man Della had spent 12 years not speaking to, and then he told her why. 19 years ago, he said, he had come over that pass in the worst stretch of his life. Drinking, broke, driving a truck he was about to lose, with a plan in his head for the bottom of the canyon that he had mostly made up his mind to follow through on. And there had been a light. Just a light up at the top of the third curve. An oil lamp in a window where there should not have been one. And he had pulled in, he did not entirely know why, and a man he had never met had made him coffee, and not asked a single question and let him sit by a wood stove until morning, and had said something to him as he left, which was, "The light's always on up here, son, you remember that, any night you need it." And Cyrus Beale had remembered it. For 19 years he had remembered it, on every bad night since, and he had not gone to the bottom of any canyon, and he was here now to thank a dead man for his entire life. Word travels strangely in mountain country, along old phone trees and church bulletins and the long memory of small towns. Within 2 weeks of Cyrus Beale they began to come. Not many at first, and then more. They came up the switchbacks in the long evenings when the work let out down in the valley, headlights climbing toward the only light on the mountain, and they parked in the gravel lot and got out slow. And most of them stood for a moment, looking at the building before they could make themselves come to the door. Because the building was the thing they had been carrying around inside themselves for years. Pilar came on a Thursday. She was in her early 40s now, steady and warm, and she ran the free clinic down in the valley 2 days a week, and she told Della that she had come over Halloran Pass 20 years ago at 22, with a black eye and a 4-month-old and $40, and a man 2 hours behind her who had promised her she would not get far. She had not known where she was going. She had only known she was going. And there had been a light at the top of the third curve, and a man who made her tea and did not ask her one single question she did not want to answer, and who put her in room 2 and gave her the office phone and a list of numbers in his own handwriting, shelters, a women's advocate in Helena, a county number that could keep her name out of the system. She had used every one of them. She had her own name now. She had a daughter in college and a clinic full of people on their worst days, and she had spent 20 years, she said, telling herself she would drive up here someday and thank him, and she had let 20 years go by, and now she was thanking a chair by a cold stove and a woman she had never met. Della told her the chair counted. She believed it did. Joaquin came on a Saturday with his whole family in the truck, his wife and 3 kids, and he stood in the lot and could not at first get the words out. He was a county road foreman now, the man who kept Halloran Pass open all winter, which Della would later understand was not a coincidence, was in fact the most deliberate thing a person could do. 26 years ago he had come up this road 4 days out of Deer Lodge with a kind of record that closes every door before you knock on it, and Walt Hartley had given him room 6 and a hammer and a week of roofing work, and had paid him in cash at the end of it, and shaken his hand and called him a good worker. And Joaquin told Della, with his kids listening, that no one had called him a good anything in a long time before that, and it had rearranged something in him that had stayed rearranged for 26 years. He plowed the pass now. Every storm. He kept the road to his own salvation open with his own hands, and he had never once told anyone why. And he was telling Della now because the man he had been keeping it open for was gone, and somebody ought to know. A woman named Ruth came, who had been the runaway girl of 19 in the ledger, except she was 60 now, and she had driven 6 hours from Idaho when she heard. And she sat in the office and held the page with her own entry on it, and traced her father's drawing of the little lamp beside her name with one finger, and did not say anything at all for a long time. A man named Gabriel came, who was a pastor now in a town across the divide, who had been the man in the car below the second curve in 1994, the one who would not give his name. He gave Della his name now. He said he had spent 30 years trying to be the light for other people, that an old man had been for him on the worst night of his life, and that he had a whole congregation full of people who had no idea they owed their pastor's life to a motel on a closed road, and that he would like, if she would let him, to bring some of them up here someday to see it. Not all of them were grand. That was the part that undid Della most in the end, the small ones. A heavyset man in his 50s named Dale, who drove a propane truck, who pulled in one evening and stood in the lot, turning his cap in his hands and could barely get the words out. And what he finally said was that he didn't have a big story, he just wanted her to know that one February his truck had broken down up here when he was 20, and broken scared of his own father, and Walt had let him use the office phone and given him a cup of coffee, and more than that, had talked to him for 2 hours about nothing in particular, about engines and weather, and how a man learns to be a man, and that nobody had ever just talked to Dale like he was worth 2 hours before, and he had thought about that night his whole life. He had named his own son Walter. He had never told the old man that. He had been meaning to drive up and tell him for 30 years, and he had run out of road. He cried in the gravel lot, this big propane truck man, and Della stood with him and did not try to fix it, because she had learned by then that some griefs are not problems to be solved, but debts to be witnessed, and the witnessing is the whole of what you can do. They came up the mountain 1 and 2 at a time, all that spring, and they stood in the lamplight and told Della who her father had been, and she wrote down every story in the back of the ledger because it felt like the only proper place to put them. She began to understand something about the geography of the thing, sitting in that office night after night. Her father had not run a business. He had run a kind of rescue station disguised as a business, at the exact altitude where people ran out of options, at the precise point on the map where the easy roads gave out and only the hard one was left. They never come up this road by accident, he had written. By the time they got to him, they had run out of every other road. And he had understood that, and he had stayed up there for 30 years on the strength of that understanding. Alone, with an oil lamp and a 3-legged dog, keeping the last road lit. She started keeping a guest book of the living. She did not entirely decide to. It simply began to happen, as the most important things in that place seemed to, without anyone deciding. And by the end of April there were more than 30 names in it, people who had driven hours to stand on a cold gravel lot and grieve a man the county had appraised at 0. By the end of May there were 60. The book filled up faster than she could have believed, with the proof that a single quiet life, lived deliberately at the right altitude, can hold up an entire region the way a keystone holds up an arch, invisibly, by being exactly where the weight comes down. It was the first week of May when the silver truck came up the pass, and it did not belong to anyone who needed a light. Before that, though, on a raw night in late April, Della had taken in her first guest, and she had not planned that either. A man came up the pass a little after 11, an ordinary man in an ordinary sedan, lost, his phone dead, low on gas, badly shaken from sliding on a patch of late ice on the second curve and very nearly going over. He had seen the light. That was all he could say at first, standing in the doorway in the cold with his hands not quite steady. He had been coming down off the summit in the dark, certain he was alone on a closed mountain. And there had been a light at the top of the 3rd curve, and he had aimed for it the way a drowning man aims for anything that floats. Della put him in room 2. She did not think about it. She lit the wood stove in the unit and brought him a bowl of the stew she'd had on the office burner and let him sit and get his hands back, and she did not charge him. And when he tried to insist, she told him the same thing she had read 400 times in her father's hand, that it was a room nobody was using, and he could pay it forward when he was able. He left in the morning with a full tank from the spare cans in the shed, an address to mail a thank you to, if he felt like it someday, and Della stood in the lot and watched his taillights go down the switchbacks into the gray dawn. And she understood with a force that put her hand against the doorframe that she had just done the exact thing that had gotten her. Walked out of the Cardinal Inn with a cardboard box. The exact thing, a free room for a frightened strangers on a bad night. Brent Cooley had a word for it. Her father had a different word for it. She knew which word was true, and she knew it all the way down, and the knowing settled into her like a foundation pour going hard. She went inside and opened the ledger and wrote it down. The man from the second curve, room 2 one night. And beside it, with a hand that did not shake at all, she drew a small lamp. It was the first one in her own writing. It would not be the last. Della was up on a ladder repairing the vacancy sign when she heard it. A big new pickup, the kind that costs more than the building it was driving toward, and it came up the switchbacks too fast and pulled into the lot in a spray of gravel that made Tuck heave himself up and put his body between the truck and the office door, a low sound starting in his old chest. The man who got out wore a quilted vest over a pressed shirt, and the kind of confident, easy smile that Della had spent 19 years learning to read across a front desk. He looked at the building and the lot and the view down into the valley, and his eyes did the thing she recognized, the appraising thing, the counting thing, and she knew, before he opened his mouth, that he was Brent Cooley in a more expensive coat. His name was Garrett Vance. He was, he explained, a regional development partner with a firm out of Bozeman, and he had a proposition for her that he thought she was going to like very much. He had done his research. He knew her circumstances, he said with a sympathy that did not reach his eyes, knew she'd had a hard run lately, knew the property was a burden, back taxes and all. He gestured down the mountain at the long blue gleam at the bottom of the valley, the Halloran Reservoir, and he laid it out for her like a gift. There was a development coming, a resort, a marina, a whole lakeside community, and the access road they needed ran right through the old highway, right past this shelf of flat ground with its 100-mile view, and his firm was prepared, in light of her difficult situation, to be extremely generous. He named a number, $45,000, cash, for a property the county said was worth nothing. He said it like a man naming a number he expects to end a conversation. He told her she would be a fool to turn it down. He said, and here his smile thinned out into something truer. That, of course, the alternative was that the county was going to come for those back taxes one of these days, and a condemned structure on a parcel they needed for the road was the kind of thing that had a way of getting condemned for real. And wouldn't it be so much better for everyone if she just took the very fair money and let go of a dead man's mistake? Della came down off the ladder slowly. She looked at the silver truck and the pressed shirt, and the number hanging in the cold air between them. $45,000. 9 days ago she had had 160 Rs to her name. The arithmetic was not subtle. Garrett Vance was watching her do it, watching her face, the way Brent Cooley had watched her face. Certain he knew exactly how this went, certain that a tired 45-year-old woman with nothing would take the money the way exhausted people always do. I want to stop us right here for 1 second, because this is the moment the whole story turns on. And I do not want you to miss it. If you have ever watched someone with money assume that a gentle person can be bought, you know exactly the feeling in Della's chest right now. If a story where that assumption finally, completely backfires is the kind of thing you came here for, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we go on and turn the bell on, because the next part is the reason I wanted to tell you this one at all. Now, let's find out what Garrett Vance did not know. What Garrett Vance did not know was that Della Hartley had spent the previous 2 weeks reading every page of her father's ledger, and every letter in his box, and that in among the thank you notes, folded small and kept separate in an envelope of its own, she had found a different kind of document entirely. It was a copy of a legal instrument, drawn up and recorded with the county 19 years earlier, in the same year Cyrus Beale had pulled in off the road with a plan for the bottom of the canyon. Walt Hartley had not been a worldly man, but he had been to a lawyer in Helena exactly once in his life, and he had spent money he did not have to do one thing, and Della had read the document 4 times to be sure she understood it, and then she had driven down to that same lawyer's office to be absolutely certain. She let Garrett Vance finish his pitch. She let him name his number twice. And then she told him, in the same quiet, even voice she had used across a front desk for 19 years, that the property he was standing on could not be sold for development. Not by her, not by anyone, not ever. Garrett Vance's smile did not move, but something behind it did. She explained it to him the way the lawyer and Helena had explained it to her, slowly so there would be no misunderstanding. In 2006, her father had placed the entire parcel under a permanent conservation and charitable use easement, recorded with the county and held by a small Montana land trust. The easement did 2 things. It prohibited in perpetuity any commercial or residential development of the land beyond the existing structures. And it dedicated the property by binding covenant to a single specified purpose, which the document named in language Walt must have chosen himself, because it did not sound like a lawyer. The provision of shelter without charge or condition to travelers in need on Halloran Pass. Her father had given away the development rights to his own land 19 years ago for nothing and locked them away forever, precisely so that no man in a silver truck could ever someday stand in this lot and offer his daughter money to put a marina where the light used to be. The road Garrett Vance needed did not run through Walt Hartley's property. It ran through the one thing on that mountain that could not be bought. She watched it land on him. She watched the number he had been so sure of go quiet in the cold air, and the easy confidence drain out of his face, and the calculation start up behind his eyes as he tried to find the angle, the loophole, the pressure point, and failed to find any because there was none. A perpetual easement is exactly what it says it is. The back taxes could be paid, and Della intended to pay them now that she understood what she was paying them for. The structures could not be condemned out from under a recorded charitable trust without a fight. His firm's whole timeline could not survive. Garrett Vance had come up the mountain, certain he was dealing with a desperate woman and a dead man's mistake. And he was leaving it having discovered that the dead man had beaten him to the only move that mattered, by 19 years. He tried briefly, the way his kind always tries. He suggested the easement might be challenged. He suggested she should think very carefully. He suggested, with a last thin edge of the threat he had walked in with, that a single woman alone on a mountain with no money might find a legal fight expensive. And Della Hartley, who 9 days earlier had been walked out of a building she loved by men exactly like him, looked at Garrett Vance across the lot where her father had kept a light burning for 30 years, and told him, without any heat at all, that he was welcome to challenge it, that she had the land trust, and a Helena lawyer, and 400 witnesses in a book, and every person in that valley whose life her father had saved, and that he should ask himself how a jury in Quill, Montana, was going to feel about a Bozeman developer trying to bulldoze the place that had sheltered half the county. She told him the light stayed on. She told him to drive safe down the pass, because the third curve was treacherous, and her father had pulled more than one man out of the canyon below it. Garrett Vance got back in his silver truck. He did not slam the door, which Della respected slightly. And he drove down the mountain, slowly, the gravel crunching under his expensive tires, and the old 3-legged dog stood in the middle of the lot and watched him go all the way down to the valley floor, and did not lie back down until the truck was gone. The thing about a light on a mountain is that people see it from a long way off. The story did not stay on the pass. It went down into the valley the way water goes down, finding every channel, and within a month it had reached the regional paper in Helena. Because Pilar from the clinic knew a reporter and could not stop telling the story of the man who had saved her life with room 2. The reporter drove up the pass on a June morning and sat in the office with Della and the dog and the ledger, and she read the entries, and she read the letters, and she went very quiet, as everyone did in that room, and the piece she wrote ran on a Sunday under a headline that was not overwrought. That was in fact almost too plain. For 30 years, a man kept a light on for strangers. His daughter found the proof in a desk. What happened after that, Della could not have predicted and could not for a while quite manage. The phone she'd had connected in the office did not stop ringing. People wanted to donate. People wanted to volunteer. A contractor down in the valley who had once, it turned out, spent a night in room 4 during a divorce he did not think he would survive, showed up with 2 trucks and a crew and rebuilt the sagging roof on the low units for nothing, and would not be argued out of it. The land trust that held the easement, a tiny operation run out of someone's spare bedroom, suddenly had more interest in the switchback than in anything it had ever held, and helped Della set the place up properly as a nonprofit, so the donations had somewhere to land, and the back taxes could be cleared, and the lamp could keep burning on something more reliable than one woman's $163. The donations themselves told their own story, if you knew how to read them, and Della had learned how to read exactly this kind of story from her father's book. Most of them were small. $10, $20, a folded check from a fixed income with a note that said I stayed there in 1998. I never forgot. A retired schoolteacher in Bozeman sent $100 a month with no explanation and never gave her name. An envelope came one morning from a federal prison 2 states, and inside it was $41 in cash. Every bill soft and old, and a note in careful block printing that said, "This is everything I have right now. The man up there gave me a week of work when I got out, and nobody else would look at me. Tell his daughter the roof he taught me to patch never leaked." Della sat with that envelope at her father's desk and the $41 in her hand, and understood that she was not, in fact, running a charity. She was running the far end of one. She was the place where the kindness her father had let out into the world 30 years ago was finally coming home, dollar by crumpled dollar, the long, slow return of a thing he had cast on the water and never expected to see again. There was one more thing the newspaper brought, and it was the one Della had not let herself hope for. On a warm evening in late June, a small car she did not recognize came up the switchbacks and parked at the edge of the lot. And a woman got out, mid-30s, and stood by the car door for a moment, the way you do when a place is bigger inside you than it is in front of you. 2 children climbed out of the back, taller than Della remembered, a boy and a girl, and it was the children Della knew first before she knew the mother, because she had watched them sleep in room 114 of the Cardinal Inn on the worst night of their lives. The woman with the split lip. Except her lip was healed now, and her name, which Della had deliberately never written down, was Sarah, and she had seen the newspaper, and she had driven 200 miles to find the woman who had sat with her in a lobby at 2 in the morning and made 2 phone calls and not written down her name. Sarah did not have a speech ready. She just stood in the gravel and said, "You lost your job because of us." Della said it was not because of them, it was because of her, and she would do it again, and she had in fact done it again up here, with the door unlocked. Sarah looked at the lamp in the office window, and the units behind it, and the dog, and the sign that said vacancy, always, and something moved across her face that Della recognized because she had felt it herself the first night on this mountain, the slow turning of a person who has just realized that the worst thing that happened to them was a door, and that the door opened. Sarah and her kids stayed the night, in room 2, because 2 was the room her father had always given the ones who had run out of road. In the morning, Della watched their little car go down the switchbacks into the valley. She went inside and opened the ledger. And she did not write Sarah's name, because some names you still protect even when the danger is over, but she drew the small lamp anyway, beside a blank space, and she understood that this was the entry that had cost her a job and given her a life, and that the arithmetic on that, the real arithmetic, the kind no clipboard could do, came out so far in her favor that she had to set that pen down and breathe. She did not get rich, that was never what it was. But she got something she had not had since the day. Brent coolly slid a letter across a desk, which was a foundation, a floor under her feet that no regional manager could pull out from under her. A place that was hers in the way that mattered, not because the deed said so, but because she had read every name in the book and understood what she was keeping. Garrett Vance's firm did not give up quietly, because firms like his almost never do. In July, there was a county planning hearing in the courthouse, down in Quill, an ordinary procedural thing about the reservoir development and its access road, the kind of meeting that 900 people usually let 4 people attend. The firm's lawyers had found, they believed, an angle. They argued that the conservation easement was vague, that a charitable use covenant written by a layman could be challenged, that the public interest in jobs and tax revenue outweighed one stubborn old man's handwriting. They came down from Bozeman in good suits, and they were not wrong that the law had gray in it, where they were pointing. What they had not counted on was the room. Della had not organized it. She had only mentioned the date, once, to Falar, and Falar had mentioned it to a few people, and on the night of the hearing the courthouse in Quill could not hold the crowd. They came down off the pass and in from the valley and over the divide, and the county commissioners sat at their long table and watched a town fill its own meeting for the first time in living memory. One by one, people Della had never met stood up at the little microphone and said the same thing in 100 different ways. Cyrus Beale stood up and said a light on that mountain had kept him out of the canyon below the third curve 19 years ago, and he had a wife and 2 grandchildren now who existed because of it. Pilar stood up in her clinic scrubs and said she had come over that pass with a black eye and a baby, and the place they wanted to bulldoze for a marina was the reason both of them were alive. Joaquin stood up, the man who plowed their road all winter, and said he would keep the pass open for free for the rest of his life, but he would not stand by and watch them tear down the reason he was a free man at all. Gabriel the pastor read 3 lines from a thank you letter in the cash box, and the room went so quiet you could hear the old radiator tick. The lawyers from Bozeman packed their briefcases before the public comment was even finished. There are fights a firm can win and fights a firm cannot afford to be seen winning. And a roomful of the people a dead man had saved, looking at you while you try to put a marina where the light used to be, is the second kind. The access road was rerouted around the parcel within the month. It cost the development time and money, and the firm absorbed it as the powerful always absorb their small defeats, quietly, hoping no one keeps a record. But Della kept a record. Della kept all the records now. That was the job she had inherited. She kept the office. She kept the wood stove and the armchair, with the broken elbow and the shelf of soft paperback westerns. She replaced the wick in the oil lamp, but she kept the darkened chimney, because 30 years of burning was not a thing you wiped clean. She fixed the units one by one, with the contractor and a rotating cast of volunteers, many of them people from the book, people her father had sheltered, coming back up the mountain to put their hands on the place that had saved them. And she ran it exactly as he had run it, as a refuge. No charge if you need it, pay it forward when you can. A light at the top of a road that the interstate had bypassed, for the people who, even now, even still, sometimes had nowhere else in the world to go. They came. That was the thing that surprised her most in the end, and the thing that did not surprise her at all. Even on a dead road. Even 30 years after the traffic stopped. The people who needed a light have a way of finding it, and the new sign she painted herself and hung on the tall steel post said the same word her father's had, in the same plain block letters she had inherited from him without ever being taught. Vacancy, always. Tuck lived another year and a half, which the vet down in the valley said was a gift no one had any right to expect from a dog that old, and he spent it in front of the wood stove and at the edge of the lot, watching headlights come around the third curve, and when he finally went, in his sleep, in the warm office, Della buried him under the lodge as at the spot where he used to wait, and she put a flat stone there and nothing else, because some things do not need words. She got another dog, eventually, a young one, 4-legged this time, from the shelter in town. But she never stopped thinking of Tuck as the first witness, the one who had decided, in the cold April dusk, that she could be trusted on this mountain, the first living proof of what her father had quietly been. Her brother came up from Denver the following autumn. His name was Glenn, and he was 3 years older than Della, and had spent those 3 years, and everyone since being the practical one, the one who got out, the one who measured things in the same units the world measured them in, and had done well by it. He stood in the doorway of the office, where their father had lived and died, and he looked at the ledger open on the deck, and the letters in their cash box, and the new units rebuilt and full, and Della watched something move across his face that took him a while to find the name for, the same way it had taken her. He picked up one of the taped pairs of reading glasses from the cigar box and turned it over in his hands, and his jaw worked. He had sent their father money once, years ago, a good amount, the year his business took off, and it had come back uncashed with no note, and Glenn had taken it as the old man's pride, as a rebuke, and had carried the sting of it ever since. Della showed him the entry from that same month in their father's hand. Glenn's check, it said. Send it back. He needs to keep what he earns. I have everything I need up here. Glenn read it twice. He said, I told you to sign it away. She said, I know. He said, I didn't know, Della. I didn't know what he was. And she said, neither did I. That was the worst part. And then the best part after. The two of them stood in the lamplight a long time and did not say much else, because some debts between people who love each other and could not find the words get paid in standing quietly in the same room at last. And Della understood that too now, because she had read 400 versions of it in her father's hand. 2 years after Brent Cooley walked her out of a building with a cardboard box, Della Hartley stood in the office of the Switchback Motor Court on a December night with the snow coming down hard and the pass closing below her. And she did the thing she did every evening now, the thing the card had told her to do, the thing her father had done every night of his life up here. She filled the oil lamp. She trimmed the wick. She struck a wooden match and touched it to the wick and watched the small flame catch and steady itself in the smoke-darkened glass. And she set the lamp in the window where it could be seen from the third curve, a light at the top of a road the world had forgotten. For travelers who almost never came, except that they always eventually did. Then she did one more thing, the thing she had been working up to for 2 years. She opened the ledger to the first blank page, after 400 and some entries in her father's careful block hand. She picked up the pen, and in her own writing, which she had been surprised to find, looked more like his every year. She wrote the date, and below it she began a new column, the way you start a thing you intend to outlive you. The first entry was a young mother and a child, a flat tire on the third curve in the first storm of the season, given room 2 and a hot meal and the radical experience of not being charged for surviving a bad night. Beside it, the way her father had taught her without ever teaching her anything. She drew a small lamp. She had learned, over 2 years on the mountain, the thing her father had known for 30 and never once said out loud, because he was not a man for saying things out loud. A legacy is not the building you leave. It is not the money of which there was none, or the land which could not be sold, or even the name on the deed. A legacy is the light you keep burning when no one is watching and there is no profit in it and the whole world has appraised you at 0. It is a book full of names. It is the door you never lock. It is the simple, stubborn, world-changing decision to keep the light on and then to hand the matches to whoever comes next. She thought about that often now, on the long nights when the snow came down and the pass closed, and it was just her and the dog and the lamp. The men with the clipboards and the silver trucks moved through the world certain they could see what things were worth, and they could see almost nothing, because the only instrument they had ever been given measured price, and the things that hold a life up are not for sale and never were. Her father had figured that out young, somehow, and had spent his whole quiet life acting on it, 11 miles above a town that never knew. And the proof of him was not in any bank. The proof of him was in 400 names, and a clinic, and a plowed road, and a pastor across the divide, and a stranger who aimed his car at a light in the dark and lived. You could not put that on a spreadsheet. That was the entire point. That was the thing the powerful would never understand, and the gentle would never forget. The men who had measured Della Hartley and found her Irwanding had made the oldest mistake there is, which is to confuse the price of a thing with its worth. Brent Cooley had called 30 years of kindness a case of fraud. Garrett Vance had offered $45,000 for something that was, in the only accounting that ever finally matters, priceless. They had both been so certain. They had both been so completely, catastrophically wrong. Della set the pen down. The lamp burned steady in the window. Down in the valley, the lights of Quill came on one by one against the early, dark 900 people at the bottom of a mountain. And some unknown number of them owed their lives to a quiet man and his light, and now to his daughter and hers. The snow came down, the pass closed, and 11 miles up an abandoned road, in a building the world had valued at nothing, a light stayed on for anyone who needed it, the way it always had, the way it always would. Keep the light on, she did.